Hello everyone, and thank you for joining my presentation today on how governments govern iconoclasm towards monuments. My name is David Dreyos, and I conducted this research in 2019 while at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. Over the last few months, we've seen the rapid removal of monuments. That public sculptures, plaques, or perhaps even street signs have the power to incite protest or conflict. This has been done by, or pressured by, protesters who argue that these commemorations are no longer valued or appropriate for their community. The act of removing or modifying monuments, I contend, are acts of iconoclasm. Performing this destruction can create a conflict called an iconoclash and can have tremendous consequences. Only through careful management can negative effects be mitigated. Heritage researchers have often focused on the protesters, the iconoclasts or loss-averse actors, but there is often a shallow investigation of how governing organizations manage iconoclasms. As my dissertation supervisor, Dr. Rachel King, put it, we need to stop casting governments as monolithic entities. For this task, I used the perspective of examining governmentality, the conduct of conduct, or how governments act to enact. How do government interventions have genealogies? How do they diagnose problems and prescribe solutions? What are the boundaries of these solutions? And how can governments react when they reach a limitation? For a case example of iconoclasm, I selected the iconoclash over the statue of Governor Edward Cornwallis in Halifax, Canada. To begin with, I want to establish the genealogy of the commemoration of Edward Cornwallis. In 1749, to solidify their rule in the province of Nova Scotia, the British Trade Board assigned a new governor, Edward Cornwallis, to move the capital and found the new city of Halifax. The indigenous Mi'kmaq people opposed this and conducted a raid in response. Cornwallis, who had orders not to provoke the Mi'kmaq, instead issued a bounty for any killed or captured. The 175th anniversary of the city's founding was celebrated in 1924 with a reenactment of the founding and a visit by the Royal Navy flagship HMS Hood. Spurred by this and the recent acquisition of a portrait of Cornwallis for Province House, in 1929, the Premier of Nova Scotia handpicked a committee to create a permanent commemoration to Cornwallis. The statue they commissioned was unveiled in 1931 in the park outside the new railroad station and hotel, with the aim of making it a tourist attraction. The genealogy of the statue, like many problematic monuments, is a 20th century product wrapped in a pride for colonialism. For a city with a major Royal Navy base, a British loyalist community, and its proximity to Britain, this accurately represented the contemporary community, or at least the premier who led the commemoration effort. In 1993, Mi'kmaq journalist and elder Daniel Paul penned an article and later wrote the book, We Were Not the Savages. In this work, he found that the use of Cornwallis' scalping proclamation as policy befitting of the term genocide, as it intended to exterminate the Mi'kmaq people. At the book launch, the keynote speaker was the Premier of Nova Scotia, John Savage. In 1999, with the 250th anniversary of the founding of Halifax, the city was still ignorant of this new interpretation. In poor taste, the city invited the Mi'kmaq people to participate in the anniversary, to provide a canoe of their warriors to reenact meeting Cornwallis, portrayed by an actor. The Mi'kmaq refused, and Paul vocally criticized the celebration. In 2000, after the railroad became defunct, Halifax Regional Municipality took ownership of the Cornwallis statue and park. Furthermore, both politically conservative and progressive provincial governments ignored petitions for the removal of commemorations to Cornwallis in both 2008 and 2009. Altogether, this demonstrated a failure of Halifax and shows the larger Canadian genealogy to willfully ignore Indigenous issues. The city of Halifax began to diagnose a problem when the councillor for the area around Cornwallis Park, Wayne Mason, began to recognize the calls for the removal of the statue in 2014. Particularly after he heard concerns at an urban planning meeting. On a national scale, the systemic racism against Indigenous Canadians became more recognized with Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission releasing their final report and calls to action in 2015. Halifax that year passed a statement of reconciliation to adopt these calls to action. Mason further credits a 2015 national discussion about Indigenous reconciliation by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for inspiration to address the statue of Cornwallis. This shows Halifax adapted to new narratives by following national direction on the issue and listening through pre-existing channels, such as planning meetings and elected representatives. As a result of this, Mason put forward a motion in May 2016 to request a staff report on how to create a committee to advise on how to commemorate Cornwallis. The prescribed solution of having an advisory committee negotiate the iconoclasm would be the approach the city would adhere to throughout the case example. 2 polls conducted by Halifax and an independent firm showed that a majority of people wanted a committee to use public engagement to reach a consensus. However, when presented to only keep or remove the statue, people preferred to keep the statue as is. Halifax recognized they had a problem. Most people did not relate to the iconoclasts. A commemoration committee would be a risk-averse approach, since it would only give recommendations and the decision would still need City Council approval. It also could deflect backlash away from the government onto an independent or expert group that was interpreting public input. This could be seen as an example of government governing through repair, where Halifax wanted to make reparations for colonial attitudes, but in quantifiable and minimal terms. So what obstacles did this prescribed solution face? An obstacle Halifax would continuously face would be the depiction of the issue in the media. Mason's 2016 motion for an exploratory staff report was simplified by the press into the following headline: City Council will consider a proposal to scrub the name of its controversial founder, Edward Cornwallis, from public commemorations. This national news story raised tensions and rallied people to lobby City Council, and the motion was defeated. The following day, the statue was vandalized with red paint. This obstacle was bypassed by the fall of 2016 municipal election, where the incumbent Mayor Mike Savage, the son of the aforementioned Premier John Savage, campaigned on holding consultations with the public and Mi'kmaq on what to do with the statue of Cornwallis. His opponent, Lil McPherson, instead wanted to lower the pedestal height of the statue and add new plaques. Savage was re-elected and a new councillor, Sean Cleary, reintroduced a version of Mason's motion, and it was adopted by council in May 2017. Cleary had been inspired to do so by Halifax's first Mi'kmaq poet laureate, Rebecca Thomas. The next obstacle was the city's management of protesters and counter-protesters. On July 1st, 2017, on the 150th anniversary of Canada's founding, Canada Day, the Proud Boys, a far-right organization, non-violently confronted Indigenous protesters at Cornwallis Park. These counter-protesters were later confirmed to be military personnel, and the story made national headlines, putting the spotlight on Halifax once again. In the wake of this, a protest was planned to tear down the statue. This was not sanctioned by a regional Indigenous government, the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs. Mayor Savage neutralized the situation by meeting with these iconoclastic protesters in the park and having the statue draped by city workers. After a discussion, they took a list of calls for action back to City Council. One action was to remove the statue immediately. This was not adopted. Instead, the city involved the Mi'kmaq Chiefs in the formation of a commemoration committee. When faced with the spectacle of protesters being further magnified by the media, the City Council showed a willingness to listen to the iconoclasts and gave them power by involving the marginalized community's leadership in the committee. The final limitation that Halifax encountered was establishing shared governance of the committee. With its appointees being split 50-50 between it and the Mi'kmaq Chiefs, in January 2018, a problem arose. The nominated co-chair by the Mi'kmaq had been previously convicted for sexual assault in 2008 and subsequently served 3 years in prison. A city councillor was reported by the press to have refused to accept the nominated co-chair on the commemoration committee because of this previous conviction. The city tried to resolve this internally, however they reached no accord, and the leaked list of appointees and the disagreement were published by the press. Again, another instance where the media magnified a problem. In an interview with the press, a leaked appointee was quoted saying, "I'd have to walk out if there was any disrespect towards the nominated co-chair. This will collapse if they're not willing to participate in good faith." Frustrated, the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs publicly stated that the formation of the commemoration committee was taking too long and that they were pulling out of discussions until the statue was removed. This was an unexpected obstacle for the city, who did not anticipate a conflict over the appointment process, and which threatened to discredit the whole committee. The Mi'kmaq, on the other hand, had power over the city, and by publicly withdrawing support, they gave the protesters a signal to remove the statue. Accordingly, plans for a protest to topple it appeared on social media. A staff report came forward to the mayor, and council recommended removing the statue, putting it in temporary storage, and then re-engaging with the Mi'kmaq in the previously planned process. staff did not recommend it to be permanent, as doing so without broader community discussion reduces the opportunity for educational and constructive dialogue, particularly with the majority of Halifax's population that currently indicate a preference to see the statue remain. The city voted to place the statue into temporary storage and to continue to form the committee. The controversial co-chair and nominee who commented to the press were removed as appointees. The statue of Edward Cornwallis was removed on January 31st, 2018. By October 2018, the now renamed Commemoration Task Force convened for the first time, a joint funded initiative with the Mi'kmaq chiefs, now with in-camera proceedings. This privacy removed the ability for external forces like media to criticize discussion, but there now was criticism that the committee was not being held accountable to the public. This created accusations that the committee would be a rubber stamp of approval for removing the statue. The committee held 5 public consultations and received 65 unique inputs, 39 for removal, 12 for modification, and 14 for a total return of the statue. This was a low sample size and conflicted with earlier polling data. In July 2020, the Commemoration Task Force submitted their final report to City Council. Council agreed and voted for the park to be renamed and the statue not to be returned. Instead, it is to be placed into a planned civic museum. Several opposing opinion articles ran in the paper the following day. A strong majority of council saw this as a positive step, but opposition stated that the task force had a predetermined outcome. More councillors in favor still lamented that they removed the statue, but did not educate the public as why. So, what can we learn from examining governmentality? The best advice for governments is to allow monuments to be challenged regularly and be observant of changes in their community's values. Governments move slowly, but they can be predictable and they could provide the space for input to make incremental changes that have community consensus. This already can be accomplished through existing channels like city planning or by contacting elected representatives, and avoid having a polarized yes or no situation with little consensus. Since removing a monument can be done quickly, an obstacle governments face are pressures for urgency by iconoclastic actors to correct long-ignored problems quickly and decisively. Governments have their own measures of success. For a democracy, this might mean public perception in elections. It is risky for them to adopt a policy as emotional as removing heritage without some public consensus. To determine the popular consensus, they can conduct polling or hold an election. As a compromise to correct this obstacle, any prescribed process to address urgent calls to complete iconoclasm of a monument should rapidly get actors together to work towards a consensus. A threat for every actor is the media, which can be weaponized by either loss-averse or iconoclastic actors. This can be seen in the use of protests and spectacle, opinion pieces and columnists, or simplifying complex issues. This can entrap a government between both sides and stop a consensus from being reached within the community. Unfortunately, this vulnerability to media and criticism can cause governments to react by limiting government transparency, which causes a loss in public credibility. For Halifax, the threat of protests and perhaps violence magnified by the media created a situation that forced the city to remove the statue of Cornwallis. They continued their original prescribed solution, but the more private task force could not legitimize the iconoclasm for the loss-averse actors. Halifax's government failed to manage the iconoclasm, but wasn't loss-averse. On the contrary, Mayor Savage and council seemed to support the removal of the statue, but was limited since a majority of the community opposed the removal. Constrained by their own measures of success, they needed to find a solution with consensus, but prescribed solutions were overpowered when tensions became unmanageable. A more ideal solution would have been to recognize calls for iconoclasm earlier and to work towards a compromise solution quickly to diffuse the tensions, followed by a review process for future progress. Thank you all for watching. Here are a few questions to begin the discussion with. Who and how should judge public monuments? Could a plebiscite, opinion polling, or review process be used? To get consensus, should opposing parts of a community be convinced beforehand to remove a monument? Are there situations where the historical magnitude of a monument is so great that it should overrule a community's opinion? And what should be done with removed monuments? Should replacement monuments be installed? How should this decision be made? I look forward to answering your questions at the live Q&A session.